I would always tell people use less slides. That's
Yeah.
so like, my department head was sitting in the classroom, and at some point he said, like, this is great. What Henning does is fantastic, and nobody should learn from him. And I look at it. I think it makes sense. I think I took a very a kind of German, quirky kind of entrepreneurship persona, which is already comes across as a little bit weird, and then I come with these kind of odd examples.
Good morning, everybody. So let me introduce our celebrity guest for the talk show today is Henning Piezunka. Am I getting that right?
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay. Who is currently assistant professor at INSEAD. He earned his PhD from Stanford in 2014. He is, interestingly, a former entrepreneur. He launched and then later sold a 25-person web design firm. His teaching focuses, therefore, on new business ventures where he can build upon his own experience in the classroom as a former entrepreneur. His research is on an interesting and somewhat eclectic mix of topics on crowdsourcing, competition, collaboration, innovation, and as we will see later today, also on artificial intelligence. He won the European Business School Award for Best Paper Published on Innovation Management a few years ago. And a few years before that, also the Darmstadt Innovation Award for Best Paper on Innovation. He was a finalist for the 2015 SMS Best Conference PhD Paper Prize. He sits on the editorial boards of Organization Science and Academy Management Review. Also serves on the Strategic Management Division of the Academy of Management, the research committee for that division. Has numerous publications, including 2 in ASQ, 3 in AMJ, 1 in Organization Science, 1 in Research Policy, 1 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Has accumulated in his short career already 942 Google Scholar citations and rising every month. Amazingly, 4 years in a row, he won the INSEAD Best Teacher Award. That's quite incredible because I'm sure that INSEAD has its share of outstanding teachers. He was named one of the Poets and Quant's best 40 under 40 professors in 2019. And I'm definitely going to ask him about this later because he posted on his personal website an 11-page document of job market advice for PhDs. So we'll definitely get into that toward the end of the interview. So please join me in welcoming Henning.
Thanks so much, Rich. This is fantastic.
Good. So, you've seen my interviews, so I like to start off by asking a question about, how my guests found their way into this particular profession as a strategy professor, because I've never known a 10-year-old who said, I want to be a strategy professor when I grow up. So, I assume that everybody has an indirect pathway into this career, and clearly you did as a former entrepreneur. But tell me, from the beginning, how did you wind up in this career as a strategy professor?
This kind of started early for me. I realized this when reading the newspaper. I was like a big reader of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is like the German version of the New York Times, probably comes closest to you to think about. And they always have like a column on Monday. They continue to have this, where like some business school professor, like an economist, actually kind of reflects on something which is going on in the economy. And that was like, so I always read that column and the sports section, basically. Those were like my 2 go-to points. And so I continued to be fascinated by business, and I enjoyed thinking about it. And then when I created my company, so my company was created more like as a hobby project. But as I did this, I realized I enjoyed much more thinking about the mechanisms which drive it than actually managing it. So I was constantly like sitting there like, hey, what is going on here? Why is that person not motivated? Why are we actually having problems with the supplier and stuff? So I always was very keen on abstracting from it. And so this idea of kind of studying this came very early. And you see, then but I think this is how it's often for people, right? Then there's quite a little bit of path dependency on luck. I joined an apartment with somebody who really wanted to do a PhD in the US, and I had no idea why you would ever do a PhD in the US, but he would kind of prepare for it all the time. And so I learned about it. And so I thought like, oh, look, this seems to be like a really cool thing. And this is how I got into it. But there's not like a large scale plan. So it's like a bunch of these kind of accidents, basically, which let me stumble into this.
Interestingly, so how did you wind up in Stanford in particular?
So what I did is I actually started doing like research on different topics I really cared about in Germany. And then I realized, oh, look, I would really like to go to the US, but I would love to have like a taste for it. Okay. And so this was a really lucky coincidence. The two topics I was interested in were industrial organization and system dynamics. And when I Googled those two terms, the only person who came up was Scott Rockert at Duke. And
yes,
so I decided, like, look, he seems to go to the System Dynamics conference, so I'm going to attend the System Dynamics conference, which is a total like weirdo plan if you think about it. But so I booked a ticket for the System Dynamics conference, and this was like my closest I ever had to a religious experience. So the moment I boarded the plane, I got an email, because you're a first-time attendee of the conference, we have assigned a mentor to you. Your mentor is Scott Rockert from Duke University. And I had like, you see, there was nothing, no form or anything I could fill. It was pure coincidence. And so Scott took incredibly good care of me. And I basically kind of followed him through the whole conference. And at some point, Scott was like, look, I'm going to get you an internship at Duke University, but you need to let me alone a little bit at the conference. And this is what he did. So I went to Duke for 3 months, had a fantastic time, took a class which was taught by Will Mitchell and Michael Lennox, and kind of started developing a little bit my research interest. And I had a meeting with Ari Lewin, and Ari was like, look, you should really read like stuff by Kathy Eisenhardt. And I was like, who? And he was like, look, you really need to know who Kathy Eisenhardt is. And so I downloaded her working papers and stuff like this. And so, and I got completely fascinated. And so I wanted to either go, so I fell in love with a paper by Jason Davis, which came out by Jason Davis, Kathy Eisenhardt, and Chris Bingham in ASQ at some point. And so again, not like really like being almost naive, I kind of flew to Boston to meet with Jason Davis and say like, hey, I like your paper, I want to talk about this. And
what was it, by the way, what was it that you liked about the paper? Just out of curiosity.
You see, like I had done these system dynamics classes in my master when I did my master's at LSE, and I was really fascinated by this modeling. But I got a little bit, I don't want to say by bored by system dynamics, but it felt like a little bit limited to me at the time. Mm-hmm. And the simulation Jason had written was like close enough for me to understand, like the stochastical modeling, and like closer to what you would actually do in, like closer related to like the organizational kind of problems I was interested in. And so it continues, funny enough, it continues to be one of my absolute favorite papers. So if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's about how things are not necessarily, it's about U-shapes, basically, about contingency theory and how things are often U-shaped, but the key insight is basically that the U is not symmetric. And kind of the different kind of factors the U depends on. So it's a beautiful paper. It won also the ASQ Best Paper Awards like a few years ago. And so I got completely obsessed with this. And so I went to Jason at MIT, and what was supposed to be a half-an-hour discussion ended up being like a 2-hour discussion. And at the end, Jason said like, oh, look, I'm a first-year assistant professor. I can't take you on as a PhD student. And I was like, oh no, this is like really what I wanted to happen. And he said like, look, but I'm going to give a call to Kathy Eisenhardt. And you see, I was like, well, this is one of these things where people say they give a call, but nothing happens. But that actually turned out not to be true. He actually gave a call to Kathy Eisenhower. And the next day, Kathy Eisenhower called me, and we had Kathy and Rita called me. We had a half an hour discussion. It was incredibly kind. And they said, do you, and the next day they sent me an email, do you want to come to Stanford? And I said, yes. And so
Terrific.
I can't say the rest is history, but that's the beginning of my career.
That's the easiest PhD application process I've ever heard.
No. I was in parallel the whole application thing doing. So,
right.
So I submitted all of this, but afterwards, I don't know if people still do this, but I was so afraid of rejections that I afterwards retracted all my other applications. So I felt like this is the best I can get. And I really don't need to have like a bunch of rejections now. I'm going to go to Stanford anyway. There's no need for me to get like a rejection from all the other places I applied to. So I took the Stanford offer and said, thank you, I'm off the market.
That sounds wise.
Yeah.
So remind us a little bit about, well, first of all, maybe tell us a little bit about what the Stanford PhD program was like for you. How was it to be a PhD student there?
Look, every PhD program is challenging, right? So I'm not going to fall into this and say like everything is awesome and the weather in Stanford is great, right? So this is there are challenging aspects about it. For me, I think this sometimes gets a little bit underestimated. I was not a native speaker, and so just because you kind of nail the TOEFL with like 300 points does not make you like a proficient reader of American scientific literature. So I remember this Glenn Carroll assigned Exploration Exploitation as the first paper, and I wrote in the upper right corner seems to be about mining, because I had like no idea what like search is about and exploration and exploitation. I could just not think about this in any reasonable way. So it comes with its challenges. There are multiple things which are fantastic about the program, about Stanford and about the program. So at Stanford, it's very, very common that you take classes from different kind of departments. So a lot of classes are co-listed. So you would take classes at the Stanford GSB in Management and Science Engineering, which was my department. You would take classes in education or sociology with Woody Powell or Dan McFarland. So you can really kind of, it's strongly encouraged that you tap into all the resources of the school. And I felt I benefited enormously from that. So that is something I enjoyed. There's probably little for me to say, which has not yet been said about kind of Kathy and Rita, who kind of take great care of the PhD student, kind of really help them to kind of develop their research agenda. Yeah, so look, for me, it was a life-changing experience, no question about it. I also met my wife there, so yeah.
That's a bonus.
Yeah, totally.
And that, you know,
at least for me. So
the thing about being a first-year PhD student and unable to fathom some of these research papers, that's not unique to people who are not speaking their native language, right? That as a native speaker of English, I remember as a first-year PhD student getting these papers by Williamson and by Ron Burt and thinking, what are these people talking about? You know, so that's even a native speaker can have trouble with that. So yeah, so remind us a little bit about, you know, what was your actual dissertation topic at Stanford and how did you find that topic?
So I'd written this already in my research statement. I was very interested in platforms. So I really was interested in platform kind of markets. I wrote my second year paper about platforms. And so I always looked into these kind of markets, and I was fascinated by like the word, like think like Feng Shui, Marc-Ian City, and so right more in economics, Jean Tirole, Marc Rocher. So Annabelle Gava's book had a huge influence on me. So I was really fascinated by that. And so I read a lot of that literature, and then I took like a slight pivot, is probably not the right term, but I then got really interested in the relationship. So I read like a ton of video game papers. And one relationship that I always found very exciting, but which was somewhat underrepresented in that, was the relationship between the developer and the publisher. So all of the work was basically focused on the relationship between this kind of couple, the developer-publisher couple, and the platform. And I was really interested in the developer and publisher because it felt like, to me, there was a little bit more, for lack of a better word, human tragedy in there, like status dynamics, who gets attention and stuff like that. And so, yeah, and then Feng Shu was incredibly kind, gave me part of his dissertation data, so I could build on that. And started developing you see, like Ethan Malek had written a fantastic paper at the time around 2012 about video games and the role of managers in video game developers and video game publisher companies. And so I got really interested in this. I adopted the data source he used. And so, yeah, so I really got interested in this developer and publisher relationship and who partners with whom. The paper is forthcoming now. For everybody who struggles to publish your job market paper, I started my paper in 2010. It's now forthcoming in 2021. So good luck to all of you. So yeah, and so this was the paper. It's very much about the question: which kind of developers want to be a big fish in a small pond, or a small fish in a big pond? So under what kind of circumstances do you want to partner up with like a large publisher, where you're then just a small fish, or whether you want to partner with a rather small publisher, where you then kind of play a bigger role. And then what happened in parallel is that I got my hands on a fantastic data set on crowdsourcing. And so that is pretty much, that kind of basically determined my Stanford time, that on the one hand, I pushed my dissertation, and at the same time, I also did this work on crowdsourcing. Yeah.
So you had almost 3 parallel programs going at once, even as a doctoral student.
2, I would say. I did the dissertation on the video games, and then I did the crowdsourcing work, which I did mostly with Linus Dalanda. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Nice. So, so let me ask this question: doctoral students often find it relatively easy to find a topic, but perhaps more difficult to narrow the topic down to a particular research question. How did that go for you? Did you find you had any trouble doing that, or what was your experience with getting the topic narrowed down to an answerable research question?
Your question makes total sense for me. For me, that was somehow not so big of a problem. I get a lot of inspiration from movies, and I had watched Jerry Maguire over and over again. So you remember this, like, show me the money, right? And so this idea that a football player suddenly has an agent who really just has like one person who he represents struck me as like, oh, that's really interesting, right? And maybe that player is now actually better off. It's not a super famous agent anymore, but he has like full attention. And so this kind of big fish, small pond idea, that was very present from the beginning on. The paper is rather complicated methodologically, I would say. And total kudos to my co-authors who have helped me to kind of helped me to overcome some of these challenges. Plus the whole reviewer team at AMJ, who has done a fantastic job on this. So no, I started early on. You see, like, I had the empirical setting, and then this kind of big fish, small pond was a little bit clearer. So, but you see, Rich, this is probably a function of how I work, right? You see, like, I often my work is very often relatively phenomenological, that I figure out like, oh, look, this is like an interesting tension here, or like an interesting problem. So it's not that I would say like, oh, I want to make a contribution to this particular literature, but I typically find more like, oh, wow, I don't have an answer for this. So look, I give you another example for this. I talked with David Kelly, the founder of IDEO, about my research on crowdsourcing. So this was pure coincidence. He was munching his salad on Stanford campus. And I felt like, okay, this is my one chance in a lifetime to talk with David Kelly. And so I just went there and said, like, do you mind if I sit with you for 5 minutes? And he was like, sure, was very kind. And so I described to him the research I did on crowdsourcing. And this was very much about how you generate ideas and how you select ideas. And he said like, okay, I know all that. And I was like, oh, great. Now I've spent like 5 years of my life studying this and you already know this. But then I at least had the presence of mind. And I said like, what don't you know? And he said like, I don't know how to write good rejections. And I was like, oh, I also don't know how. And so he described the problem very nicely. He said like, look, what happens is I have every day 100 people coming to me with really good ideas, and I need to say no to 99 of them. How do I make sure that they come back the next day and bring me a new idea? And I didn't have an answer to this, and the literature didn't have an answer to this. And so you see, and that's just, the papers ends up being framed around networks and ties, but it really started more like, it started much more phenomenological about rejections. Yeah.
So what did you find were the biggest, the biggest challenges in executing a dissertation on this topic? What were the challenge, and how did you overcome them?
Look, I think so. So Kathy has a saying, and I believe, you see, even if she tells it to you, it's still true, that she says like, people underestimate how difficult publishing is. And I think that because you see, you read all these papers, you go through these PhD classes, right? And you read like, okay, for next session, we're going to read 4 papers. And for the next session, you're going to read 4 papers. And you're just drowning in papers. And there's so many papers. And at some point, you come to the conclusion, can't be that difficult to write these papers. There are just so many of them.
I've had only one that went smoothly through the review process.
Yeah, okay. I'm still waiting for that, Richard. No, that's not true. I had some positive experiences. But you see, I think then the kind of realization how deep you need to go, right? That you basically, that there are footnotes you spend like 1 or 2 months on, right? That there's like a robustness check where you suddenly need to say like, okay, with a 99% probability, this is just going to come out the way I expect it to be or the way it's supposed to, but I still kind of hunt this down. So this is a, look, I've done this multiple times by now, but I think that is to realize how deep you need to go into these papers really, right? I mean, think of Louis' work, right? If at the beginning you think like, well, it's like internal networks, employee patterns, how hard can it be, right? But then you go into like the details of it, and you're like, oh my God, this single kind of model 5 has probably taken you like 8 months to run or something like this, right? And oh yeah, this doesn't work with that method, so you basically need to invent like a new method to run this, right? So I think as a doctorate student, it's pretty hard to anticipate the kind of challenges you will run into,
right?
And how much it then takes to kind of to get them out of the way. I think that was challenging for me. I will say I was extremely lucky that so you take people like Linus Dalanda and Rita Katila, who were like the first two people with whom I worked intensely on empirical papers, right? Who very often helped me to navigate this and very often carried an enormous amount of the load. Yeah.
So, okay, so let's go past, past the PhD years. So, you've been out for a number of years now. You've done, a fair amount of research on a number of different topics. And as I mentioned in the introduction, seems like a somewhat eclectic mix of topics. So can you tell us a little bit about what drives your choice of what topics to research and how you decide what projects you're going to commit to?
Yeah, so this has, I would say this has changed a little bit over the years. So I would say there are 2 big blocks kind of at this point in my research. And the one which are distant, but where there's quite a bit of overlap. I continue to be interested in crowdsourcing. and in particular, in how you kind of build up these relationships at an enormous amount of scale, right? It's very different from interacting with a single person and suddenly interacting with like a vast number. And I'm interested basically in how these kind of relationships kind of play out. How do you make the decisions in these kind of settings? How can you, like my recent paper with Vikas Agarwal and Hart Posen, for example, about how can you structure like a crowd? What is the implication of this? My work with Linus is very often about who do you need to pay attention to that people continue to engage and so, but it's very driven by this, like, look, you need to, the information is all there, right? But it's distributed across a crowd of people, but you need to engage it, right? And it's a little bit different than a classical kind of network relationship. And that is something I continue to find extremely fascinating. And so that is kind of, I continue to work in that realm. The second stream is, and I call this embedded diets, is, look, very often when you look at like a relationship or at the diet, there's some kind of a tension going on. And that is very often due because of another kind of relationship, because it's embedded in some other way. Very often there's like a competitive element to it. And so you see, for example, I have this paper with David Clough on Formula One teams, which try to actually evaluate their suppliers. And what we find is, they are not just looking at their own performance, but they're also looking at the performance of other teams relying on the same supplier. So you have this kind of diet, but to understand the diet, you really need to kind of look at the triadic constellation. And you see, like, and this kind of answers your question nicely. Then I did a study with Jemba Lee on succession in family firms. And at first sight, this is like nothing to do with one another, right? That you would say like, okay, you study family firms, you study succession in family firms, and you study Formula One teams. But here's the thing, what we figured out is, so we looked at, this is a case study of successions family terms where the father kind of passes on the leadership to the son. And what we figured out, the key driver of successes or not is the mother. The mother is basically the key of whether the succession gets to work. And so we call this the uniplex third. And the mechanism is very interesting. So what happens is that the father is willing to basically give up the leadership, but he wants to stay the head of the family. And if the mother is involved in the company, it becomes very hard to kind of take like a step down in the company, but still to remain the head of the family. So the best thing what the mother can do is basically to kind of totally separate these spheres, right? All of these people have like multiplex relationships. And what the mother needs to do is basically to separate these out and to say like, look, there's the business, here's the family, all right? And if you give up status in the company, it will not affect your status in the family. And then the mother has a role, which I think is like, this is my personal highlight of the paper. She actually has two characteristics which are very, very uncommon to have in the same person. She is seen as neutral in business matters by the father and the son because she's not involved in the company, but she's also trusted by both because she's the mother, respectively the wife. Right? And if you think about it, that kind of renders her like the perfect media or moderator of conflicts because she's totally neutral, but she's totally trusted. And if you think about the kind of moderator you want to have or why it's so difficult to find a moderator, it's because both parties want to have somebody who you trust. But if both parties trust the moderator, then very often the moderator is not neutral, right? It's very difficult to find somebody who both people trust and to expect to be neutral. And so, but you see, like in that sense, so coming back to your original question, so I care about these kind of triadic constellation. How do you get these relationships where there's a little bit kind of tension, which are a little bit, where there's friction, where the relationship is a little bit on the edge? I like to think about them as kind of delicate relationships, how you manage these. Yeah.
That's great. I love that. That's a great story. So let me ask you kind of the next logical question, which is within each of those two streams, you know, crowdsourcing on one hand and what did you call it, embedded dyads on the other, as well as the other literatures that you dabble in with regard to innovation and other related topics. What do you think are the most important unanswered questions in these literatures that we really ought to have answers for by now?
You see, one topic I've thought a lot about with respect to crowdsourcing, or like one area where I hope there's more potential, is we have at this point like a lot of research on these kind of crowdsourced communities like Wikipedia and so on, right? Think of like Anne Macharek's work, Feng Shu's work, and so on, right? And I often wonder what other organizations can learn from that more. So it feels a little bit, we have this kind of little island there. But I felt, you see, like in a funny way, the one organization which was really not disrupted by COVID in that sense is Wikipedia, right? Oh, we're working.
May have been helped, actually.
Yeah. Huh?
It may have been helped, actually. Yeah.
We're working from big home and everything is remote. Welcome to the club, right? So that is something I wonder about from a research perspective, as well as like a teaching perspective. What can we learn from these kind of organizations? What can we learn from these kind of organizations for like classical organizations? Yeah. In terms of networks, I think it's look, I think in general, kind of, you see, like the unanswered question, like this is always like some great paper comes along and then like, oh, wow, this opens up like an enormous amount of questions, so to speak. I'm curious about how relationships will change as more and more things will go digital, right? So if you think, for example, so Jason David is doing research on this, which I think is fascinating, that collaborations, for example, change. Right nowadays, so much is simply done by APIs. It's not anymore, let's chart a flight, we all go and kind of write a contract. No, it's more like, oh yeah, we follow them on Twitter and they have a great API or so. So I think our kind of classical conception of like how networks are, what networks are and what constitutes a relationship and how these evolve will change. And then obviously, Rich, everything I have as a working paper, that's like.
Of course.
Of course.
You wouldn't be working on it if you didn't think it was important for the, important unanswered question.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, you have posted on your web page. Let me show this to everybody. You have posted on your web page a document called "How to Succeed on the Job Market," job market advice for PhDs. And if you've watched my videos at all, you know that I always ask this question of my guests: what's your most important piece of advice for PhD students? And clearly you have done more thinking about that question than any other guest I've ever had on here, because you've written 11 pages of it. And, reading it, let me see, I get anxious immediately reading it, because I'm like, no distraction, 100% focus. It's kind of, so tell me, what is out of this whole 11-page document? Can you give us maybe some highlights? What are your most important pieces of advice that you give to your own PhD students or to PhD students in general?
So Rich, I give you one piece of advice which I think is not in the paper, or in the document, but which I believe is very important. I believe it's 2 years ago, and the movie which won the Oscars was the Korean movie Parasite. And in his speech, the director quoted Martin Scorsese by saying the most the most creative is the most personal, or the most personal is the most creative. And I often feel, look, I think people should have a personal, somewhat of a personal linkage to their topic. It should kind of, it should, you see, like either they are personally fascinated by it, or they have some personal experience to it, but it should kind of, you should really be curious about it. There should be like a personal element about it. So I always struggle a little bit when and I don't mean this, you see, this sounds like a critique. It's not meant as critique, because I think people just kind of oblige to the norms. But when people come into my office and apply for a PhD and they're like 23 years old and say like, I'm really fascinated by the interaction between the experience of the top management team and mergers and acquisitions in market heat. And I was like, I must have been like a really odd 23-year-old because I didn't care about these topics at all, right? So I think there is, look, you need to join a conversation, and there's no question about it. But like Jesper, and I owe this, I took Jesper Sorensen's class when I was at Stanford, and Jesper Soren said something which was incredibly helpful to me at the time. He said like, look, you're all here because we expect you to see the world a little bit differently than we do. And I was like, oh, that's nice, because and you see, for me this was incredibly helpful because I was at Stanford and everybody seemed to have like 3 friends at the USPTO, the US Patent Office, and I didn't know what the abbreviation USPTO stood for in the 3rd year of my PhD. And so I felt like, oh wow, you see, I'm just not going to be the guy who's going to make like a major contribution with USPTO data, because I don't know it. It has never affected me in my life. I'm probably not going to be that person. But you know what? I've actually watched a lot of Formula One in my life. And you see, like, and then I realized, look, these kind of things can actually be like a cool topic. And I was always like obsessed with like, oh, why is there collisions in Formula One? When does it happen that 2 cars crash into one another? And so I wrote a paper which basically predicts like, when does competition escalate into conflict? But you see, like it came out of a personal interest. And you see, if somebody is purely interested in patents, I think it's fantastic. It's nothing against patents or so, but I think people should have like a personal inkling to be about it, and not, you need to join a conversation. But like, I think the way to do it is to say like, look, take a topic you care about. Why do you care about it? And think about how can you make that part of the conversation? What can you bring to the conversation?
Fascinating. That's great. Yeah, that's great advice. I think I know, a number of people who have done that very effectively. Russ Koff comes to mind because, he took his prior job as a consultant and basically, took that topic and ran with it, and several other people as well have done that. So yeah, I think that's great advice. And I like that point about, you're here because we expect that you're going to see the world a little bit differently. And that's true. And that's one of the great ways that the field gets, richness, is because each one of us does see the world a little bit differently. That's part of why I like the field of strategy. I tell people, almost no matter, maybe there's some limit to this, but almost no matter what your strength is, there's a place for you in this field, right? If you like to interview people about their jobs, there's a place for you in this field. If you like to find, odd caches of unusual archival data and study that, there's a place for you in this field. If you like to run statistical analyses, there's a place for you in this field. If you like to run simulations or do, solve mathematical puzzles, there's a place for you in this field. So I think, it's great that we have a field that so many different people can come to with so many different perspectives and passions and find a place.
Yeah, you see, if you think about like the people who kind of make these fields, right? You see, like people like Ron Ainer, Rahul Kapoor, right, or the younger generation, Doug Hannar, they truly care about ecosystems. They wake up and think about ecosystems. At least that's my guess, right? I talked recently to Ethan Bernstein at HBS, And the guy is totally about transparency, right? It's not a surprise that he's like a world-leading scholar on transparency. He really cares about the topic, right? He reads everything about it. He writes his paper about transparency. So yeah, so you bring these personal interests to it, and yeah.
I was going to ask you a question. How do you, as Rich was alluding to about INSEAD, there's so many great teachers there. What did you do to stand out among such a distinguished group as far as teaching at INSEAD? Well, I guess your experience as an executive was probably very helpful.
You see, it's funny. People often say this. I'm not sure I benefited a lot from that. I think it gives you a little bit of credibility with it. I think so. I got lucky, and I don't mean this as like a humble brag or something like this, or like as false modesty. I chose a very particular way of teaching. So if you look at so you're gonna laugh at me, but for like a 90-minute class, I often have like 500-600 slides. So my classes are a little bit more like movies, and so I invested. So I invested in a ridiculous amount of time, sure, but then I tried to create a little bit like a movie experience. So my role model of when I kind of present a topic is typically, how would Christopher Nolan talk about small world networks? How would Martin Scorsese kind of illustrate lean entrepreneurship? And so you see, like in a very vague way, like not that I do like shots or something like this, but I try to kind of tell a story around it. I try to present it in an appealing way, and I got incredibly lucky at the time. I had a research assistant who had an incredible design talent. He's now a PhD student at Stanford, Philip Reinecke, and to help me to kind of get the whole thing started. And so it has become now like a guilty pleasure of mine. So I work on teaching every day for an hour, probably. But it's really something, you see, it's like something I enjoy. So the way you might do like play a music instrument, or you might do like painting. So I would go in and say like, look, let me kind of do like a bunch of slides here and think about how I can kind of present this concept like in a better way. That's the, and you see what I mean by what I found. You see, like, for example, when I, you see, when I talk about entrepreneurial careers, for example, I use an example of the revolution, or the failed attempt of a coup in Spain in the 1980s. And for some reason, like, students found that really appealing. So, but you see, that could have gone like bad shit wrong, right? Like you see, so the first time I taught this, I was like incredibly nervous, because it was like, okay, I tried to explain entrepreneurial careers by talking about a coup d'etat in 1980 in Spain. If people now write in the application and say like, that person is crazy and this has nothing to do with entrepreneurship, I would say like, well, fair point. But it has worked out for me so far. Yeah, I haven't taught in the MBA since 2018, so I go back in 4 weeks for the first time in 3 years. I'm incredible. I'm very excited about it. So.
Wow. Just on the surface, if I try to have too many slides, it has the exact opposite effect. But I can see with the focus you're giving on the creating some kernel of excitement.
Yeah, but you see, it's not. You look. I would always tell people, use less slides. That's like, my department head was sitting in the classroom, and at some point he said, like, this is great. What Henning does is fantastic, and nobody should learn from him. And look at it. I think it makes sense. I think I took a very a kind of German, quirky kind of entrepreneurship persona, which is already comes across as a little bit weird, and then I come with these kind of odd examples. You see, when I talk about structuring organizations, there's been a management science paper about structure in prisoners of war camps. And so I basically used that paper to talk about how you structure an entrepreneurial company. And it's, you see, for me, it's like for me, it's like intellectually interesting. But this could have gone like very wrong, right? You see, like you can see like that somebody says like, okay, great, I wanted to take a class on entrepreneurship, and now this guy talks my head off about prisoners of war camps after the Second World War. So it somehow works, but I feel like I'm like, to bring this more enriched language, so like I'm somewhere on the NK landscape, and I feel it's very steep down from in every kind of single direction. So yeah.
And you've got unique access to some of those dimensions that others don't have.
So yeah, but it's been a fun experience. You see, like it's a little bit to what I said about research. My teaching is very personal to me. So I very much care about it. It's very much like personal anecdotes, and it works well in that sense. Yeah.
Well, I'm out of questions. So thank you very much for serving as our celebrity guest on the talk show today. We really appreciate it. Everybody, please join me in thanking Henning.
Thank you.